I've been fishing this river for 32 years. This is the 32nd season, and this year the hatches have been terrible. I'm a trout fisherman, and I depend on the cold water releases. And last night at the tail of this pool here where we're talking, which is the very first pool on the Delaware, the water temperature was 72 degrees in the west branch flow at the very tail of the pool. And that is entirely too warm for good insect activity and good insect hatches and preserving the trout fishery that we now have. I'm really down on this whole thing. The river has been it's just been raped really by different interests, and this valve was put in with promises that the water flow was going to be consistent and we were going to get good releases. And we get releases, but it's not substantial enough for the summertime, and in the wintertime the river was almost dry. There's got to be a happy medium someplace. This is a very unique fishery. People spend a lot of money up here for this fishery. It's been publicized. People travel all over for a fishery like this, and here we have it right here in New York State, and nobody appreciates it. It's a truth. It's really a shame to admit it, but it's the truth. The fishery that we have here is just not appreciated, and it's a good thing. It should be. Something's got to be done to protect the fishery and to promote it better than it now is.
Well, I guess we'll go back way back when, 200 years ago, when all these hills were totally forested. All the rivers in this region were trout fisheries, meaning that they had cold, clear, pollution-free water, and the trout fishing was fantastic back then. When industrialization happened, all these hills were totally clear-cut, and all of the soil and the big sponge that was in that upper layer washed downriver and changed this whole area forever. Probably it'll take centuries before it comes back to that way it was. So we're left to deal with that problem as it is. In the early 20s and 30s, New York City realized that they were going to need some more water. The Hudson River was really polluted, and New York was growing like crazy. They needed more a source of fresh, clear, unpolluted water, and they came to the Delaware basin to get it. Wanted to build some dams, and after long court sessions and finally got approval to build some dams up in this area. And then actually New Jersey, realizing that if the dams were built, the Delaware River would be flowing a lot less down in New Jersey, so they took it to court one more time. And most of the current regulations that we run off of here are based on a 1954 Supreme Court ruling that basically set some standards, set an arbitrary number of a release at Montague, New Jersey, that a minimum flow of water had to be maintained at Montague, New Jersey of 1,750 cubic feet per second. So once the dams were all in place, and the inadequacy of that Supreme Court ruling, there was still a lot of squabbling going on. So the federal government said, well, we need to have an agency to oversee this whole area. And that's the Delaware River Basin Commission, was formed in 1961. They were given some authority, but really don't have control of water flows out of the reservoirs. New York City built the reservoirs for New York City water supply, and that water is diverted out of the Delaware Basin, and therein lies the big problem. 50% of the water that that comes into this basin through precipitation is diverted out of the basin. And the difference here lies in for instance, many of the reservoirs out west are used for power generation, so that the water that's held by the reservoir eventually is going to go down the river. It's just the timing has changed when it comes down the river. So that river will, in fact, get all of the water that should flow down the river. Here, the underground canal system, or tunnels, divert the water from the reservoirs to Roundout Reservoir and eventually to New York, and there it dumps in either to the Hudson or into the Atlantic, so that water is never available to go down the rivers, down the Delaware River. What that means is that we leave the rivers in chronic drought situation. After the Supreme Court ruling of 1954 and the establishment of the Montague target, which was at 1,750 cubic feet per second, and the establishment of the Delaware River Basin Commission, the Commission did stop a lot of the squabbling and infighting, so that all of the problems didn't end up in court. But the Supreme Court ruling was I think the best that they could do at the time. Pretty much when the word ecology didn't have much meaning yet, and the ecological consequences of the water releases to the habitat of the river were not even considered. I guess one of the benefits, the benefit of the reservoirs releasing cold water into these rivers actually tends to bring back the original natural conditions of cool water in the rivers most of the year. And they reestablished a trout fishery. And this has turned into a wonderful trout fishery because of that cold water coming out of the dams. Let's see.
Nature Conservancy is interested in moving towards ecologically sustainable water management on the Delaware. In other words, a better balance of human use and ecological, supplying ecological needs. This, in the upper Delaware in particular, there's kind of been an imbalance towards the human needs since the Supreme Court decree of 1954, where the only ecological target truly was well downstream at Montague. What Nature Conservancy is interested in is moving towards flows that make sense for the ecology of the upper Delaware in frequency of flow, rate of change of flow, timing, durations of flow. We need to get a better idea of what the system needs, but then start moving towards it on the Neversink, the East Branch, the West Branch, and because of that, the main stem. So we're proposing a process that can take us in that direction, that would incorporate the objectives and interests of all the parties, but allow the ecology of the river and the economies that depend on that ecology, such as the fishing industry, to benefit more than they are at this point.
Well, the Delaware River, of course, is a historic river. I mean, it's a river that's played an important role in the entire history of our country, going back to the very beginning. And of course, it is a tremendous natural resource for those of us who live in New York, but for other people in other parts of the Northeast as well. It's a major source of water for recreation and for urban populations as well. But fundamentally, and particularly in our part of the Delaware, it is a great resource, a great aquatic treasure for all of the natural habitat that it provides. And this is, I think, a large part of our responsibility, to focus attention on the natural aspects of the Delaware, to maintain it as much as possible in its natural states, and where necessary to enhance and improve and protect it. I'm very interested in doing that from the perspective of the government. I've worked on these issues in the state legislature as the chairman of the Environmental Conservation Committee in the State Assembly for a long, long time, many years, and now I have an opportunity to play, in some sense, an even more important role in Congress as a member of the Appropriations Committee and the Interior Subcommittee of Appropriations. In addition to the things that I've just said about the Delaware, of course, is important economically. It is a great economic engine for this area, and the way that we protect that economic engine is to protect the ecology of the river. People love the Delaware because of its natural qualities and because of the aquatic life in the Delaware. So as long as we can protect and maintain the high quality of this natural resource, then we can be sure that the aquatic life will remain strong and healthy. And if the aquatic life is strong and healthy, then the economy here will be strong and healthy, because so much of the economy is dependent upon a strong and healthy and diverse Delaware.
Well, I would say the real challenge is the challenge which has been in front of the region in New York City for some time, which is how do you take the glorious water supply system that was created to give New Yorkers water and at the same time recognize it's part of an incredibly valuable and delicate ecological system which is way up 120, 130 miles from New York City, and that balance is something that can only be struck if everyone works together and finds ways to manage that water supply system which meets ecological needs, local economic development needs, and then water supply needs. I think today, with the tools that we have in terms of studies, analysis, hydrological science, we have in many ways the next set of tools to manage this system for the next century. I think the genius of the system is that 100 years ago people thought how important it was to supply clean water to New York City. I think now we know there are even better ways to make sure we can continue to do that, and it's only through partnership with groups like DRBC and the Delaware Foundation that we'll find the next set of solutions.
And so the minimum flows that were established were based on what turns out to be a 400-year record drought. So that should only happen once every 400 years if that statistic is correct. However, it happens many, many days on this river system every year because of the way the system is managed. And it is totally devastating to the river, to the fishery, and to the economics involved in the whole basin. The river has a pretty good capacity to bounce back, but it still takes several years after a major fish kill. Again, if I use as an example some of the rivers out west, which are relatively the same size, the minimum flow on some of the rivers out there coming out of these power generation dams, the minimum year-round flow is 1,000 cubic feet per second. The minimum flow on the west branch of the Delaware in the winter this past year was 23 cubic feet per second. It takes around 300 cubic feet per second just to keep the river bottom wet. So you can see a 23 flow is just devastating. If we could maintain a 300 minimum flow year-round on the west branch of the Delaware, trout populations and habitat for the trout, the biomass would probably increase 4 or 5-fold. And that's my opinion. I don't really have anything to base that on, but I know it would increase. There are, this is not just a trout fishing issue. It's the total health of the whole river system that's really at the forefront of what the Delaware River Foundation has taken upon to try and get fixed. Dewatering the river has consequences that we still don't even understand. We do know that there's a endangered mussel that lives in the river that is being heavily studied, and turns out that dewatering seems to really be one of the limiting factors of its population. Certainly the trout fishery is devastated. Some of the economic interests that have developed and have developed around the river are adversely affected. The fishing, the camping, and the canoeing and rafting interests further downriver on the Delaware. When there's no water, then there's no canoeing. In Delaware County in New York State alone, the trout fishing is thought to bring in around $30 million a year just into Delaware County. So for just the whole upper Delaware, I would guess that it's probably well over $100 million when you include all the different counties, and for this economically depressed area, that's a really important chunk of money.
I began the position of Catskills coordinator about 3 years ago, and I was hired to represent the national office in the region, and largely to deal with two issues. One, a long-term home rivers project on the Beaverkill, which is the major tributary to the East Branch of the Delaware, where we've been conducting research and trying to design a restoration plan for that river system that has serious flooding and temperature problems. And secondly, to try to improve the flows in the upper Delaware system that are managed by New York City reservoirs. The Delaware River has always been a major concern for Trout Unlimited as an organization because it is such a unique and a great wild trout fishery on the East Coast. And it just happened that about 2.5 years ago, the timing was right to really devote a lot of resources to a monstrous issue that has always been a problem since the dams were built. To give you a little background on what's been going on the Delaware in the last few years, the Delaware River Basin Commission that represents the 4 states that use the river, the Delaware River, they commissioned a study on recreation in the Delaware and how to improve recreation. And so they hired some consultants to do a flow need study and to develop a computer model that New York City and the DRBC states can use to better manage this incredible resource. So 2.5 years ago, the DRBC showed some major interest in improving flows on the upper Delaware and actually the whole Delaware River to improve recreation. So it was a real window of opportunity. And I think that Trout Unlimited has made a lot of progress in coordination with the Delaware River Foundation in that regard.
And just the warm times?
Well, absolutely. I think that people, and including people in my agency and myself, we've focused on temperature for a long time as our big problem. And in fact, of course it is. The water temperature is critical for survival of the trout population, but even in those situations where we have ideal summer water temperatures, we've not found the type of trout population that you would expect in that ideal summer temperature. So I think that flows are an issue 365 days a year for both the trout and the entire ecosystem. Insects and the trout food, if you will. Maintaining a flow throughout the year is probably the next big challenge.
Over the course of the last few years, we've been working in partnership with the Nature Conservancy, who is also another organization that's interested in conservation, not just in protecting land. And they realize that the upper Delaware system is is really biologically diverse aquatically, and it deserves protection, and it can be a lot more healthy than it is right now. So we've been working with them, and also with New York State DEC in particular. They're the government environmental agency that is in charge of protecting the waters of New York State, and that includes trout streams, and that of course includes the upper Delaware system. And they've been doing their best with limited resources to try to change what is a very complicated and messy political situation. And I think what we've all realized is that in order to change the management system that is so entrenched on the upper Delaware, we really need the support of all the different agencies, the different states, and the different communities that depend on the upper Delaware.
I think the urgency might not be as important as the opportunity right now, which is that I think with a better understanding of the ecology, of river ecology in general, but also the opportunity with a number of the institutions, including the New York City DEP and the Delaware River Basin Commission, foundation like the Delaware River Foundation, now newly on the scene. There's an opportunity with these institutions to have a better dialogue, a more equal dialogue, and start getting these problems that have been around for a while better.
While I understand that the New York City problem, I think that this area is blessed with 45 inches of rain per year annually, and properly managed, there should be enough rain for enough water for everybody in the whole eastern part of the United States, New York City, and the Delaware Basin.